December 19, 1941. The air above Mount Butler was alive with fire. Smoke rolled like black waves, and the mountainside echoed with the cries of men who refused to surrender. Amid the chaos, one Canadian soldier, exhausted, bleeding yet unyielding, made a decision that would defy logic, echo through history, and terrify an empire. His name was Sergeant Major John Robert Osborne, a veteran of one world war, trapped in the inferno of another. When the enemy closed in and grenades rained down, he didn't run, he didn't plead. He did something no manual could teach, an act so selfless that even the hardened Japanese officers paused in disbelief. This isn't just a story about courage. It's the story of a man who, in a single heartbeat, transformed defeat into legend and forced the Japanese command to confront a terrifying truth, that the Allies could be broken in body, but never in spirit. If stories of real human courage move you, of ordinary people who became legends in impossible moments, make sure to like this video and subscribe to our channel Justice Unfolded. Share this with someone who loves true history, told with heart and honesty. Now, let's unfold the story of how one broken Canadian soldier made an empire realize its doom. In late 1941, Hong Kong shimmered under the winter sun like a jewel resting on the edge of an empire. Its harbor teemed with British gunboats, its streets hummed with the clatter of trams, and its hills were dotted with colonial villas, symbols of a world convinced of its own permanence. To the soldiers newly arrived from Canada, it looked like paradise: palm trees, warm breezes, and the promise of uneventful duty. The Royal Rifles of Canada and the Winnipeg Grenadiers had traveled halfway around the world expecting guard duty and ceremonial parades, a far cry from the mud and blood of Europe. Most of these men were young, barely trained, some still fumbling with their rifles. Yet there was laughter in their barracks, optimism in their letters home. The newspapers back in Winnipeg and Quebec called it a tropical posting. None of them realized they were standing on the edge of a storm that would swallow them whole within days. For the British High Command, Hong Kong was not a fortress. It was a symbol, a show of imperial presence meant to reassure allies and deter enemies. Commanders spoke confidently of the Gin Drinkers Line, a network of bunkers and barbed wire stretching across the peninsula, supposedly impenetrable. The truth was grimmer. The line was unfinished, undermanned, and dangerously outdated. Ammunition was scarce, artillery pieces were rusting, and communication systems were patchy at best. Still, officers toasted in the Officers' Club, believing the island's geography alone could repel any invasion. Intelligence reports from China warning of Japanese troop movements were brushed aside as rumors. Even when Japanese planes were spotted over the border, few believed war would come to this glittering outpost. The Japanese wouldn't dare, some said. It's bad for business. It was the kind of arrogance history remembers, the calm before the thunder. While British officers dined in candle-lit halls, the Canadian soldiers were sweating in the humid barracks of Sham Shui Po. Their uniforms were too thick for the climate, their boots already cracking from salt and heat. Yet they tried to make the best of it, playing cards, singing folk songs from home, pretending the war in Europe was half a world away. Many of them had never seen combat. They came from farms, factories, and fishing towns. Ordinary men dropped into a faraway colony they barely understood. Among them was a tall, broad-shouldered veteran with eyes that had seen too much already, John Robert Osborne. At 42, he was twice the age of most of his men. A veteran of the Great War, Osborne carried himself with quiet confidence. He didn't bark orders, he guided. When he spoke, even the restless young grenadiers listened. To them, he wasn't just a superior, he was the kind of leader who made danger feel manageable. None of them could have imagined how far his steady hand would soon be tested. By early December, the air in Hong Kong grew heavy with unease. Japanese consulates abruptly shut their doors. Merchant ships vanished from the harbor without notice. Civilians began hoarding supplies, and the confident smiles of British officers turned tight and cautious. Rumors trickled through the ranks. Whispers of Japanese forces amassing across the Shenzhen River. Still, official briefings downplayed the danger. Just a precaution, they were told. Nothing to worry about. But Osborne felt it in his bones. That unmistakable silence before the storm breaks. He spent long evenings checking defenses, inspecting trenches, and drilling his men harder than ever. Some grumbled, but he ignored them. Better tired than buried, he muttered. On the night of December 7th, he wrote a letter to his wife, Ellen, back home in Manitoba, calm, almost casual, but ending with a line that felt prophetic. If trouble comes, we'll stand fast. You know me. As the sun set over Victoria Harbor on December 7th, Hong Kong glowed like gold dust under a velvet sky. Soldiers leaned on railings watching the lights of Kowloon shimmer across the water. In the officers' mess, glasses clinked to the tune of a gramophone. A gentle breeze carried the scent of the sea, mingled with the faint hum of distant aircraft, unnoticed by most. The Canadians laughed, played cards, and joked about home. A few, like Osborne, stood quietly, gazing toward the dark horizon. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching, that this calm, this beauty, was not a blessing, but a warning. Within hours, that horizon would erupt in fire. The illusion of peace would shatter, and Hong Kong, the so-called impregnable city, would be dragged into the furnace of war. The calm was over. The fire was coming. December 8th, 1941. At exactly 8 a.m., the skies above Hong Kong did not brighten. They erupted. The morning began like any other. The Canadians were just waking, breakfast tins clattering, the harbor quiet under a gray haze. Then came a low, trembling hum, an unnatural vibration that seemed to rise from the very earth. Seconds later, the first Japanese shells screamed across the harbor and slammed into the gin drinkers' line with bone-rattling precision. The entire horizon bloomed in orange flame. Men froze, spoons halfway to their mouths. The quiet posting they had been promised was over in an instant. Osborne, already awake, sprinted through the barracks shouting orders. "Get your kit, move! Move!" Within moments, the Canadians were running toward their defensive positions, their hearts pounding to the rhythm of artillery. Hong Kong's first day of war had begun, not with warning, but with annihilation. The gin drinkers' line, proudly nicknamed the Oriental Maginot, was supposed to hold for weeks, maybe months. It barely lasted a day. Japanese troops advanced with terrifying precision, their artillery walking fire methodically across the ridges, cutting communications before the defenders even understood where the attack was coming from. The Canadians, fighting beside British and Indian units, suddenly found themselves in a nightmare. Bunkers collapsing, machine guns silenced by direct hits, trenches turned into infernos. Young grenadiers who had never seen combat were now crouched in mud, deafened, clutching rifles that jammed from dust and debris. "They're everywhere," one shouted as silhouettes emerged through the smoke. Fast, disciplined, relentless. Osborne's voice cut through the chaos. "Hold your fire! Aim low! Keep steady!" He moved like a man possessed, dragging wounded soldiers to cover, barking calm in the middle of madness. But even he could see it. This wasn't a battle. It was a collapse in slow motion. By afternoon, the Japanese had breached the line. The British command, stunned by the speed of the assault, ordered a retreat to the island. For the Canadians, it was chaos. Convoys jammed the narrow roads, horses bolted, trucks overturned. Amid the confusion, Osborne's Company A of the Winnipeg Grenadiers was ordered to cover the withdrawal. It was a suicide mission. Hold the line just long enough for others to escape. The air was thick with the smell of cordite and burning fuel. "We're buying time," Osborne told his men. "Every minute we hold, someone else gets out alive." They fought from crater to crater, lobbing grenades, firing until their barrels glowed red. Several times, Osborne left cover to retrieve wounded comrades, dragging them through gunfire as if immune to bullets. His men watched in awe, fear, and disbelief. One private later recalled, "It wasn't bravery, it was something else. Something you can't explain." As night fell, Hong Kong Island burned in the distance like a beacon calling its soldiers home. The retreat across the harbor was a desperate, haunting scene. Small boats overloaded with men, weapons, and the wounded staggered across the dark water under the whistle of artillery. The Japanese, already controlling the air, strafed from above, machine guns tearing into the sea. Osborne stood at the rear of his boat, helping row as tracer rounds stitched across the surface. "Keep your heads down!" he shouted, his voice steady even as explosions threw up geysers of water around them. One shell struck close, flipping a boat behind them. Without hesitation, Osborne plunged into the freezing water, pulling 2 men to safety before hauling himself back aboard, soaked, shivering, but alive. When they finally reached the island's shore, the men collapsed in exhaustion, coughing, vomiting, weeping. Behind them, the mainland blazed like a dying sun. Hong Kong's first line of defense was gone. By dawn on December 9th, the surviving Canadians regrouped on Hong Kong Island. The city that had once glistened with colonial confidence was now a fortress under siege. Barricades rose across the streets, civilians fled into shelters, and the once idle soldiers of the Winnipeg Grenadiers and Royal Rifles prepared for the inevitable second wave. Osborne, still dripping from the night's crossing, stood beside his commanding officer as the situation reports came in. Thousands dead, positions lost, enemy advancing. "We'll make our stand here," Osborne said quietly. Around him, the young men nodded, some in fear, others in grim determination. They knew what was coming. The Empire's illusion of invincibility had shattered overnight. Yet amid the smoking ruins and the rising sun, a strange clarity settled over them. They were no longer fighting for territory, but for each other. And as Osborne looked back toward the burning mainland, he knew this was only the beginning. Hong Kong Island, the last hope. British command insisted the island was impregnable. High ridges, coastal batteries, and a maze of pillboxes supposedly made it unassailable. But on the ground, the illusion crumbled fast. The defensive lines were a patchwork of trenches dug into rocky soil, half-finished tunnels, and bunkers without communication cables. Soldiers worked by lantern light, filling sandbags with trembling hands while the thunder of artillery echoed from across the harbor. The Canadians, exhausted from the mainland retreat, barely slept. Osborne walked the lines in silence, checking each position, offering a nod, a word of encouragement. "We hold here," he said simply, not as an order, but as a promise. Yet even he couldn't ignore the obvious. The enemy was coming, and this time there was nowhere left to run. On December 13th, the bombardment began again, heavier, closer, more precise. The Japanese artillery from Kowloon pounded the island without pause, turning the once sparkling harbor into a cauldron of smoke and flame. Buildings crumbled, oil tanks ignited, and black clouds blotted out the sun. The defenders watched helplessly as shells walked across their lines, flattening everything in their path. "They're softening us up," Osborne muttered to a nearby sergeant. But there was no retreat left to make. That night, Japanese searchlights swept across the waves, and soon small landing craft appeared, dark shapes gliding silently toward the shore. The invasion of Hong Kong Island had begun. The Canadians, side by side with British and Indian troops, opened fire. Tracer rounds streaked like lightning over the water, and the sea erupted in splashes of fire. Yet the enemy kept coming, wave after wave, relentless, unstoppable. Osborne's voice roared above the din. "Make every shot count! Don't let them land easy!" By dawn, the beaches were littered with wreckage and bodies, but the Japanese were ashore in force. Within hours, they seized footholds near North Point and Quarry Bay, splitting Allied positions and isolating entire companies. The Canadians fought desperately, often cut off from command, relying on Osborne and a handful of officers to make decisions in the field. Radios failed, maps burned, and orders arrived too late to matter. Every hill became its own war. Osborne's men held their ground, counterattacking again and again to buy precious time. "It's not about winning anymore," one lieutenant said bitterly. "It's about lasting." Still, even as the enemy encircled them, the Canadians refused to break. Osborne moved like a ghost through the smoke, rallying stragglers, redistributing ammunition, dragging the wounded into cover. When asked why he kept charging toward danger, he simply said, "Because someone has to." By mid-December, the defenders were down to a fraction of their strength. Water was scarce, ammunition nearly gone. Many soldiers hadn't eaten in days, surviving on scraps and rainwater collected in helmets. Yet, somehow, morale held. The men of the Winnipeg Grenadiers had begun to draw their courage from Osborne himself. He was no longer just a sergeant major. He had become their anchor, their living symbol of endurance. In the rare quiet moments, he would crack a joke, light a cigarette for a trembling private, or quietly share his rations with the wounded. "He made us believe we still had a chance," one survivor later said. Still, deep down, Osborne knew what was coming. Every day the Japanese pressed closer. Every night their searchlights crept further inland. The map of Hong Kong was shrinking by the hour. The Canadians were being pushed toward the island's high ground, toward Mount Butler, where fate itself was waiting. On December 17th, British command gathered what remained of their officers for an emergency meeting. The reports were devastating. Communications shattered, key positions overrun, the Japanese advancing through the mountains. "Gentlemen," one officer said grimly, "we are no longer defending Hong Kong. We are defending honor." That night, Osborne's company received new orders: fall back to the high ground and hold it at all costs. The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Hold it at all costs. Everyone knew what that meant. Still, not a man refused. They packed what little ammunition remained and began the uphill march through the shattered jungle terrain. The moonlight caught the bay below, where fires burned endlessly across the city. Somewhere in that glow lay the promise of survival, but Osborne didn't look back. "Keep moving," he said softly. "We're not done yet." Ahead of them, Mount Butler waited, a jagged silhouette against the smoke-stained sky, soon to become the site of one of the most tragic and heroic stands in Canadian history. John Robert Osborne wasn't supposed to be there. At 42, he was old by military standards, a father of 5, with a face weathered by prairie wind and years of hard labor in Manitoba. He'd already done his part. A veteran of the First World War, he'd seen the mud of Europe and the senseless bloodshed that came with it. Yet when the call went out for volunteers to defend Hong Kong, Osborne didn't hesitate. "If the boys are going," he said, "they'll need someone to keep them alive." To his wife, Ellen, it sounded like duty. To him, it was something deeper, a quiet, unspoken promise to protect. In an army filled with boys barely out of school, Osborne was the steady hand, the father figure they didn't know they needed. And though his hair was graying and his body carried the fatigue of 2 wars, his spirit was unbreakable. Osborne was no officer. He didn't have a polished accent or medals pinned to his chest. What he had was respect, the kind that isn't given but earned. In the trenches, he listened more than he spoke. When tempers flared, he diffused them. When fear crept in, he steadied it. "He had this way of looking at you," one of his men recalled years later. "And somehow you just stopped being scared." During drills, he trained them hard, not with cruelty, but with purpose. "You don't fight for the map," he'd tell them. "You fight for the man beside you." It was a lesson that would define the Canadians' stand in Hong Kong. Osborne believed that courage wasn't loud or dramatic. It was the quiet refusal to let the man next to you fall. And when the war turned against them, that belief would become his compass. As the days dragged on and Hong Kong's defenses crumbled, Osborne's unofficial role grew heavier. Officers were dead, wounded, or scattered, and the chaos demanded leadership. Real leadership, not the kind taught in manuals. When orders stopped coming, eyes turned to Osborne. He made decisions no one wanted to make: when to retreat, who to send for ammunition, which wounded men could still be carried. "You can't save everyone," a lieutenant warned him. Osborne didn't reply. He just kept moving, lifting, organizing, fighting. Every night he walked the lines, checking on his men, whispering simple encouragements. "Hang on, sunrise is coming." They believed him, not because he promised victory, but because he stood with them in every danger. In a war that stripped men of faith, Osborne gave them something to hold on to: the belief that humanity still mattered. On the evening of December 18th, the Canadians received word that the Japanese had broken through the eastern flank. The next attack would come at dawn. Osborne gathered his men in a shallow trench under the faint glow of a lantern. His face was streaked with dirt, but his voice was calm. "We'll hold this ridge," he said. "If they take it, they'll have the whole island. That means we don't break no matter what." He looked around. Young faces, pale with exhaustion, some barely shaving age. "You've done your country proud already," he added softly. "Now we do what soldiers do best. We stand together." The men nodded, silent but resolved. Later that night, as others tried to sleep, Osborne sat alone, cleaning his rifle by candlelight. He thought of Ellen, of snow falling back home, of the laughter of his children. For a moment he almost smiled. Then he closed his eyes and whispered a prayer, not for victory, but for courage. Or what made Osborne different wasn't strength or training. It was clarity. He understood something few soldiers ever fully grasp: that war isn't about glory or hate. It's about choices made in moments that define who we are. He'd seen enough to know that bravery isn't the absence of fear. It's the decision to act despite it. And as the first shells of December 19th lit up the horizon, Osborne knew his moment was coming. Every battle he'd survived, every hardship he'd endured, had led him to this ridge on Mount Butler. Tomorrow, history would remember his name, but not because he sought fame or medals. It would remember him because, when the world collapsed around him, one man chose to stand firm and shield others from its fall. The night before the storm, Sergeant Major John Robert Osborne wasn't thinking about dying. He was thinking about keeping his promise. December 13th, 1941. The British command issued the order with trembling voices: "Withdraw to the island. The mainland is lost." For the men of the Winnipeg Grenadiers, it wasn't just a retreat. It was surrendering the ground they'd fought and bled for. Smoke rose from the Kowloon Hills, the air stank of burning fuel and cordite, and the cries of the wounded carried over the wind. Osborne received the message in silence. Around him, his men stared in disbelief. "We're giving up?" one asked. Osborne shook his head. "We're not giving up. We're staying alive so we can keep fighting." It was the only answer he could give, and the only one that mattered. As darkness fell, the Canadians began pulling back through the shattered streets, their boots crunching over glass and shell casings. The retreat had begun, but survival was far from guaranteed. The roads to the harbor were choked with chaos. Trucks overloaded with soldiers and civilians stalled or overturned. Wounded men stumbled along, guided by comrades or carried on makeshift stretchers. Japanese artillery rained down without mercy, cutting off escape routes and turning every crossing into a killing ground. Osborne moved like a shadow through the pandemonium, directing stragglers, pushing vehicles back into motion, shouting orders above the thunder of shells. When one bridge was hit and began to collapse, he organized a human chain to pull the injured across before it fell. One of his men, barely 19, remembered Osborne grabbing him by the collar and dragging him to safety. "You're no good to anyone dead, lad," he said, and went straight back for the next wounded man. It wasn't discipline that held the retreat together. It was one man's sheer willpower against the chaos of defeat. By midnight, the Canadians reached the edge of the harbor. Hong Kong Island shimmered across the dark water, so close yet unreachable. The few remaining boats were overloaded with men, supplies, and the wounded. Japanese artillery spotted them almost immediately. The sea lit up with explosions as shells whistled overhead, tearing through the night. Osborne's platoon was one of the last to cross. He refused to board until every other soldier was loaded first. "Go!" one officer shouted. "You'll be left behind!" Osborne just grinned. "Then someone will have to come back for me." At last, he climbed aboard a small craft with a handful of men. As they rowed into open water, tracer rounds stitched across the waves, sparks leaping into the air like fireflies. One shell hit nearby, flipping a boat behind them. Without hesitation, Osborne dove into the freezing harbor, swimming through burning debris to pull 2 drowning men aboard. When they reached the island's shore, soaked and shivering, his men looked at him in awe. Osborne just spat seawater and said, "Next time, someone else rows." The survivors staggered onto Hong Kong Island to find no rest waiting for them. The city they'd once admired for its beauty was now a ruin. The skyline was fractured, streets cratered, and the hills echoed with distant gunfire. Civilians huddled in basements, their faces ghostly under candlelight. Osborne's company was ordered to the eastern defenses, Jardine's Lookout, Mount Parker, and eventually Mount Butler. As they climbed the narrow jungle trails, the men passed wrecked trams, burned-out cars, and the twisted remains of once luxurious villas. "So this is the Empire," one soldier muttered. Osborne glanced back. "Empire's gone," he said. "What's left is us." It was the first time he allowed a flicker of bitterness to escape. But even that moment passed quickly. He had no room for despair. Every minute they survived meant the enemy's advance slowed, and in a war already lost on paper, that counted for something. When dawn broke over the island, Hong Kong no longer felt like a city. It felt like a tomb. Smoke drifted through the ruins like fog, and the once bustling harbor lay silent except for the distant rumble of artillery. The Canadians, battered but unbroken, dug into their new positions along the high ground. They were fewer now, their ranks thinned by death and exhaustion, but their resolve had hardened. Osborne stood overlooking the harbor, watching plumes of smoke rise from Kowloon. His uniform was torn, his hands raw, but his eyes were steady. "This is where we stop running," he told his men. They nodded silently, clutching rifles that were down to their last magazines. Below them, the city burned. Above them, Mount Butler loomed, a jagged crown of rock that would soon become their final refuge. None of them knew it yet, but the hill they were ordered to defend would demand everything they had left, and more. The trail to Mount Butler was steep, narrow, and soaked in blood. The Canadians climbed through dense jungle and jagged rock, their boots slipping on roots slick with dew and ash. Above them, the peak loomed like a dark, silent fortress, the final line before the heart of Hong Kong fell. Osborne led the way, his breath heavy but his pace steady, carrying extra ammunition on his shoulders because there was no one else strong enough to. "We hold this ridge," he told his men, his voice calm, almost casual. Around them, the air was alive with distant explosions, each blast echoing up the slopes. The Japanese were coming, fast, organized, and merciless. As Osborne's company reached the summit, they found little more than shallow trenches and half-dug pits. "This is it?" a soldier whispered. Osborne just nodded. "Then this is where we make it count." The Japanese came at dawn, emerging from the mist like phantoms. Their artillery opened up first, hammering the ridge until the ground itself seemed to scream. Trees shattered, rocks split apart, and the air filled with smoke and dust so thick it turned day to twilight. When the shelling stopped, hundreds of enemy soldiers surged up the slopes, shouting battle cries that seemed to tear through the fog. The Canadians, crouched in their trenches, opened fire. Bullets cracked, grenades hissed, and the mountainside erupted in chaos. Osborne was everywhere, running between positions, shouting encouragement, passing ammunition, and firing when needed. A mortar round landed near him, throwing him to the ground. Dazed, he pushed himself up and barked, "They'll have to do better than that." His men laughed, a wild, desperate sound, and kept firing. For hours they held, until the first wave broke and rolled back down the hill, leaving the ground littered with bodies. But Osborne knew it wasn't over. It was only the beginning. By midday, the sun was a dull red disk behind the smoke. The Japanese regrouped, their snipers picking off defenders one by one. Water was gone. Ammunition was nearly spent. Still, the Canadians refused to give up the ridge. Osborne crawled from trench to trench, ignoring his own bleeding arm as he helped reposition machine guns and tend to the wounded. He seemed untouchable, fueled by something greater than fear or pain. He moved like a man who already knew his fate, one survivor later said. Late in the afternoon, Osborne led a small counterattack to reclaim a section of the trench that had fallen. Bayonets clashed, rifle butts cracked skulls, and men fought with knives and bare hands. In that chaos, Osborne was a storm, shouting, swinging, refusing to fall. They retook the trench, but at a cost. Only a handful made it back alive. As night fell, the ridge was quiet, except for the moans of the dying and the distant murmur of Japanese voices preparing for the next assault. Darkness on Mount Butler was a living thing, thick, heavy, and alive with whispers. The Canadians huddled in their trenches, cold and exhausted, listening to the enemy move closer. Every rustle in the brush could be death. Osborne sat with the remaining men, fewer than 24 now, and passed around what little food they had left. No one spoke of survival anymore. They just waited. Once a young private asked, "What'll we do if they come again?" Osborne looked at him and said quietly, "Then we'll show them what Canadians are made of." It wasn't bravado. It was faith, the kind born from shared suffering. Before dawn, the enemy attacked again. Grenades arced through the dark, exploding among the trenches. Osborne leapt up, throwing 2 back before they detonated. His men fired blindly into the smoke, shouting, cursing, refusing to yield. It was a night of madness, of courage balanced on the edge of despair. By sunrise on December 19th, Mount Butler was hell on earth. Smoke drifted in lazy spirals over the shattered ridge, and the smell of blood hung in the air. Osborne's company was down to a handful of survivors, their ammunition nearly gone. Yet, against all logic, they were still holding. Japanese soldiers circled like wolves, probing for weakness. When their final charge came, Osborne met it head-on. He rallied the last of his men, shouting over the gunfire, "Don't give them an inch!" They fought with bayonets, fists, and fury, pushing the enemy back step by step. But numbers told the story. Within minutes, they were surrounded, cut off, trapped in a shallow trench near the summit. Osborne looked around, his men battered, bloodied, barely conscious, and knew the end had come. But surrender was never in his nature. He gritted his teeth, loaded his last rifle clip, and prepared to fight to the last breath. The mountain was lost, but the spirit that held it was not. The high ground of hell would soon become sacred ground. The dawn of December 19th arrived without light. Mount Butler lay under a shroud of smoke, the air thick with ash and the metallic scent of blood. Osborne's men were no longer soldiers. They were survivors, clinging to life in a trench barely deep enough to cover them. Around them, the bodies of friends and enemies alike lay tangled in frozen silence. Then, as if the mountain itself exhaled, the quiet broke. A new wave of Japanese soldiers stormed up the slope, shouting, firing, throwing grenades into the shattered defenses. The Canadians answered with what little they had left: single rifle shots, bayonets, bare hands. Osborne moved among them, calm as ever, firing, shouting, dragging the wounded back from the lip of the trench. He was bleeding from a shrapnel wound in his leg, but he didn't slow down. "Keep fighting," he yelled. "They're not taking this hill without paying for it." The Japanese had learned. They no longer charged blindly. Instead, they began lobbing grenades, one after another, into the narrow trench, each explosion tearing apart what little cover remained. Smoke filled the air, choking the men as dust and debris rained down. A grenade landed inches from a private's boots. Osborne lunged forward, scooped it up, and hurled it back before it exploded mid-air. Another came. He did the same. Then another. Each time, he moved faster, driven by instinct rather than thought. "Keep your heads down," he shouted, his voice hoarse but commanding. His men obeyed, clutching their helmets, praying with every breath. It was chaos, a deadly rhythm of hissing fuses and deafening blasts. Osborne seemed untouchable, as if death itself was waiting for him to stop moving. But fate was closing in. Then it happened. A grenade rolled into the trench, too close, too deep. Osborne saw it instantly. Time slowed. He looked at the faces around him. 4 young men, covered in mud, trembling, trapped. They were out of time. There was no place to throw it, no way to shield them. In that single eternal heartbeat, Osborne made a choice, one that defied every human instinct for survival. He didn't shout. He didn't hesitate. He simply moved. With one swift motion, he threw himself onto the grenade, pressing it beneath his chest. The explosion came a moment later, a single, muffled thud that silenced everything else. The shockwave tore through the trench, filling it with smoke and dust. When it cleared, the 4 men were alive. Osborne was gone. He hadn't died screaming or afraid. He'd died doing exactly what he'd always done, protecting his men. For a moment, there was no sound. Even the gunfire outside seemed to falter. The surviving grenadiers stared in disbelief at the man who had just saved their lives at the cost of his own. One soldier crawled toward Osborne's body, shaking, whispering his name. There was no response. The man who had been their anchor, their calm in chaos, now lay still, his uniform torn, his face serene. Outside the trench, the battle continued, Japanese soldiers advancing through the smoke. But inside, something had changed. The men fought on, not out of orders or duty, but out of fury and devotion. They repelled the attackers long enough for reinforcements to arrive, but it was too late. Mount Butler was lost. The survivors were captured, wounded, or unconscious. Yet, even in defeat, something in the air had shifted, as if Osborne's final act had carved a line in the mountain that no enemy could ever erase. When Japanese officers arrived to inspect the captured position, they found Osborne's body still lying over the grenade, his men barely conscious but alive. The sight stopped them cold. These were hardened veterans of China, men who had seen every kind of death imaginable, yet this one left them speechless. They realized what had happened immediately. This was not surrender. This was defiance, the ultimate expression of loyalty and sacrifice. One officer reportedly said nothing for several minutes, just staring at the fallen soldier. For the first time, the Japanese command understood that they were not facing just another enemy army. They were facing men willing to give everything, not for glory, not for flag, but for each other. The broken, bloodied Canadian lying in that trench had delivered a message far louder than any victory. You can kill us, but you cannot break us. And with that, Sergeant Major John Robert Osborne passed from soldier to legend. December 20th, 1941, Japanese 38th Division Headquarters, Repulse Bay. The room was thick with smoke and the clatter of typewriters. Officers huddled over maps of Hong Kong, marking red lines of victory across every sector. On paper, the campaign was a triumph. The British garrison collapsing faster than expected, Canadian resistance shattered, the island nearly subdued. Yet amid the celebration, a single field report arrived that silenced the room. It was brief, clinical, written by an officer from Mount Butler. It described a final trench, a handful of enemy survivors, and one dead man lying atop a grenade. The officer's words were factual, but beneath the precision, there was unease. The Japanese commander read the report twice, his expression tightening. He set the paper down slowly, as if it weighed far more than it should have. "He sacrificed himself," he murmured, "to save his comrades." No one replied. In that quiet, the air felt heavier than any artillery barrage. For years, the Japanese military had built its strength on a singular belief: that no Western soldier could match the Bushido spirit, the sacred code of loyalty and honorable death. To surrender was shameful. To die for one's comrades was a virtue unique to Japan. But now, the unthinkable had happened. A Western enemy, a foreigner, had done the very thing they revered most. The officers exchanged uneasy glances. "He was not ordered to do this?" one asked. "No," the reply came. "He acted alone." That answer unsettled them more than anything. This wasn't obedience to command. It was will. It was choice. A conscious decision to die, not for emperor or empire, but for the men beside him. The realization crept over them like a chill. If their enemies possessed that kind of resolve, then this war would not be as short nor as glorious as Tokyo promised. That night, as officers pored over fresh intelligence, conversation drifted again to the story of the Canadian Sergeant Major. Some dismissed it as an anomaly, a freak act of desperation. Others, especially the older veterans of China, saw something more profound. "You can destroy an army," one colonel said quietly, "but not men who fight with hearts already given." The words hung in the air like incense smoke. Outside, the distant thunder of artillery echoed through the hills, but inside the command post, the officers sat in uneasy silence. They had seen countless enemies break under pressure, plead for mercy, throw down their weapons. But this act of sacrifice, was different. It was like staring into a mirror they didn't expect to find. In Osborne's death, they saw a reflection of their own ideals, twisted back at them from the unlikeliest of places. By morning, the mood inside the headquarters had shifted. The officers still spoke of victory, but their eyes betrayed doubt. One of them finally said what the others were thinking. "If one man like this exists, how many more?" It was a question no one wanted to answer. For the first time, the Japanese command realized they were not fighting an empire built on wealth or numbers. They were fighting men bound by loyalty that needed no emperor, no code, no divine order, just humanity. And that made them dangerous beyond measure. They could kill these soldiers, yes, but not conquer what lived inside them. Osborne's death became an omen whispered through the ranks. Proof that the West, once seen as soft and decadent, could harbor warriors as unyielding as any samurai. The victory at Hong Kong suddenly felt less like triumph and more like warning. When the news of Hong Kong's fall reached the Japanese High Command in Tokyo, the official communiqué praised the Army's brilliance. Yet in the private notes of several officers, there were mentions of something far less triumphant: an unease, a shadow over the victory. Mount Butler had been taken, but at a cost they couldn't measure in numbers. The death of one broken Canadian soldier had done what thousands of Allied guns could not. It made them doubt. They had seen courage that could not be crushed, a glimpse of the stubborn, unbreakable spirit that would one day turn the tide of the war. In their moment of glory, the Japanese command had realized a terrible truth. that they were not fighting just armies, but men who would rather die than let a comrade fall. And in that realization, the seeds of their own defeat had already been sown. Christmas Day, 1941. After 17 days of relentless fighting, Hong Kong finally fell silent. The city was in ruins, streets buried under rubble, the harbor filled with burning wrecks. British command signed the surrender at the Peninsula Hotel, their faces gray with exhaustion and disbelief. For the Canadians, it wasn't an ending. It was the beginning of another kind of war. Osborne's surviving men, battered and hollow-eyed, were rounded up with the rest of the defenders and marched at bayonet point through the smoking ruins. They passed the places where they had fought, where friends had fallen, and where Osborne had made his stand. One private whispered, "He should have seen this. He'd have hated it." But in a way, Osborne did see it. His memory walked beside them, a quiet, invisible shield against the despair closing in. The prisoners were herded to camps in Sham Shui Po and North Point, once barracks, now cages. The Japanese guards offered no mercy. Food was scarce, water foul, and disease spread faster than hope. Men wasted away in weeks, their bodies reduced to bone and willpower. Yet amid that misery, the story of John Osborne began to circulate like a secret prayer. The 4 men he had saved whispered it first, then others repeated it, passing it down through the ranks. Every time the story was told, it gained weight, not in exaggeration, but in meaning. "He threw himself on a grenade," they said, "so we could live." In the darkness of the barracks, those words became more than memory. They became defiance. Every man who heard them sat a little straighter, clenched his fists a little tighter, and reminded himself that not all battles were fought with rifles. As the months turned into years, the story of Osborne spread beyond the Canadian prisoners. British, Indian, and even captured Chinese soldiers heard it and repeated it in their own tongues. To some, it was a tale of heroism. To others, it was proof that goodness could survive even in hell. The guards couldn't silence it. The men spoke quietly between work details, in whispers over bowls of thin rice soup. "Osborne wouldn't quit," they'd say. "So we won't either." When men faltered, when hunger broke their bodies, someone would bring his name up like a spark in the dark. One survivor later wrote, "We lived on that story. It was proof that the human spirit could still choose light in a world drowning in shadow. Osborne's act had been one moment, but its echo sustained hundreds. Against all odds, fragments of Osborne's story began reaching the outside world. Smuggled letters from prisoners hinted at the man who had given his life on Mount Butler. Some were intercepted, others made it through, carried by Red Cross intermediaries or sympathetic locals. Back in Canada, families of the captured soldiers began hearing rumors of extraordinary bravery in Hong Kong, of a man named Osborne who had saved his comrades. Ellen Osborne received one such letter, written by a soldier her husband had saved. It was brief and scrawled in shaky handwriting. "He gave everything so we could come home. Please tell the world who he was." She read it again and again until the paper wore thin. She didn't weep. She just pressed the letter to her chest and whispered, "That sounds like him." When liberation finally came in 1945, only a fraction of the prisoners walked free. They were gaunt, hollow, but alive, carrying with them the legend of Sergeant Major John Robert Osborne. In interviews and testimonies, his story emerged in full detail, verified by men who owed their lives to him. Newspapers called it a tale of impossible courage, but to those who had lived it, it was more than that. It was proof that even in defeat, humanity could triumph. The war had stripped them of everything: freedom, dignity, even identity. But Osborne had given them something the Japanese couldn't take: pride. His sacrifice had not just saved 4 men, it had kept hundreds alive in spirit. And when the survivors finally returned to Canada, they didn't bring back bitterness. They brought back his name, and with it, a reminder that even in captivity, courage can be contagious. The guns of Hong Kong fell silent on Christmas Day 1941, but John Osborne's echo carried far beyond that island. When news of his death finally reached Canada years later, it didn't arrive wrapped in glory. It came through whispered accounts, coded letters, and the fragile memories of survivors. The war had ended, but for many families, the real reckoning had just begun. In 1947, inside Ottawa's solemn Parliament Hall, Canada paused to remember the men who never returned. Osborne's name was among them, spoken softly, reverently. His widow, Ellen, stood in the front row, her hands trembling as the official citation was read. "For most conspicuous bravery in the face of the enemy." Then came the words that silenced the hall. "He threw himself upon a grenade to save the lives of his comrades." The room stood in absolute stillness. It wasn't just an award. It was a nation reclaiming its pride from the ruins of defeat. Osborne's Victoria Cross, the Commonwealth's highest honor for valor, was presented posthumously to Ellen Osborne that year. The medal gleamed gold in her hands, but it was more than medal and ribbon. It was the tangible proof that her husband's final act had not been lost to time or obscured by politics. Across Canada, newspapers carried his story. Manitoba soldier's sacrifice shocks enemy command. Veterans spoke his name with awe. To them, Osborne wasn't just a hero, he was one of them, a man who had done what every soldier secretly hopes he could do, act without hesitation when it mattered most. Schools, barracks, and even streets began to bear his name. Yet behind every honor, there remained a quiet humility, a recognition that Osborne never fought for medals. He fought for men whose names history might never remember, and that made his courage eternal. With time, the legend of Sergeant Major John Robert Osborne became more than a war story. It became a moral compass. Teachers told his story not to glorify death, but to remind future generations of what courage truly means. It wasn't rage or bravado, it was compassion in its purest form. In every retelling, the focus wasn't on the explosion, but on the choice. That fleeting second, when Osborne saw the grenade and moved without thinking. It wasn't heroism born of training or command. It was love. Love for his men. Love for something bigger than himself. And perhaps that is why his story endured when so many others faded, because it wasn't about how he died, but why he did. Today, decades later, Osborne's name still resonates across Canada. His portrait hangs in museums and regimental halls, but his spirit lives most vividly in the stories passed from soldier to soldier. Every generation of Canadian troops, from Korea to Afghanistan, knows the name John Osborne. In training fields, instructors mention him when teaching what duty truly means. Veterans associations honor him each Remembrance Day, his grave visited by families who never knew him, yet feel his presence in their nation's identity. The Hong Kong Veterans Association, formed by the men he saved, kept his memory alive with fierce devotion. Many of them credited their survival not just to his sacrifice, but to the faith it instilled, the belief that even in utter darkness, humanity can shine through. History often remembers wars by victories, but sometimes the most powerful stories are born in defeat. John Osborne's life ended on a mountain half a world away, but his courage became a mirror for what it means to be human. The Japanese soldiers who witnessed his act saw not an enemy, but something holy, a reflection of their own code turned back upon them. His comrades saw salvation, his nation saw redemption, and the world saw proof that bravery knows no borders, no uniforms, no ranks. The man the Japanese once called the broken soldier was never broken at all. He was the spark that revealed the strength of an entire generation. In the end, John Osborne didn't just save 4 lives. He reminded the world that even in its darkest hour, the light of one selfless act can outshine an empire.